When we peel back the legends of Genghis Khan, a darker truth emerges. Women stolen from their lives, trapped in brutal fates. What fueled a conqueror to unleash such merciless cruelty? The real story will shock everything you thought you knew. Stay tuned, because this will change how you see history forever. When the banners fell and the smoke cleared, one of the first acts of Genghis Khan and his commanders was not only to count horses and tally loot, but to sort people. Among the living, women were singled out and appraised as if they were another kind of booty. Chroniclers who recorded Mongol campaigns again and again describe men choosing the most prized women first, and the pattern matters because it reveals how intimate violence was folded into political practice. This chapter examines what that appraisal looked like, why it mattered, and what it cost the women who were judged. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe selection criteria that sound chillingly clinical. Beauty was not only about attraction. It was a marker of status, lineage, and potential political use. The text you shared says Genghis preferred small faces, round hips, long hair, and clear voices. Those preferences were more than personal taste. Elite women often embodied the prestige of defeated households. Seizing them signaled the transfer of honor and authority from one dynasty, clan, or city to another. In the cold arithmetic of steppe politics, selecting a high-status woman was like claiming the defeated ruler's coat of arms. The process of selection had a ritual quality. After sieges, men entered the tents and courtyards of the vanquished, inspecting captives and deciding who would enter the Khan's household and who would be parceled out. Those who failed to meet the ruler's standards were often reassigned to lieutenants or camp followers. That distribution served clear functions. Loyalty was rewarded with human prizes. Political bonds were cemented through new household ties, and humiliation was public. When a ruler's daughter became someone else's concubine, the message to the defeated polity could not be clearer. There are two striking contrasts to hold in mind. On the one hand, some women who entered the Mongol court found pathways to power. A favored wife could influence decisions, manage important domestic alliances, and secure a degree of safety for herself and her children. On the other hand, the majority of captured women suffered displacement, coercion, and the daily terror of having been taken by force. The idea of beauty as currency concealed brutal realities. Where beauty was prized, it was also weaponized. Eye-catching facts further illuminate this system. The document you provided notes that Genghis kept 6 formal wives, but also had around 500 other women who were not wives. That stark ratio tells a political story. A small number of official wives held recognized authority, and their sons could inherit status. The larger group of concubines created a matrix of informal loyalties and obligations across the steppe. Another striking detail is the image of Genghis evaluating women with points. Whether or not there was a literal scorecard, the metaphor captures the transactional logic at work. Women were appraised, ranked, and allocated according to perceived value. The selection of partners after conquest also had demographic consequences. Men in positions of power could father many children across a vast territory, and the document links this to genetics. Modern research finds a distinctive lineage spreading across Asia from a Mongolian origin. While genetics cannot prove the specifics of individual acts, the demographic footprint is consistent with the historical pattern of elite men taking many partners following conquests. It is important to separate myth from documented practice. Popular retellings sometimes eroticize the image of a harem brimming with beauties, but the underlying truth is more tragic. Beauty functioned as a tool of domination. A woman's looks could grant her a measure of material safety or influence, but they also made her a target. The politics of desire created a system where women's bodies were instruments in the making of empire. We should also consider the psychology behind the appraisal. For conquerors and their followers, the acquisition of beautiful women was a visible proof of success. Taking elite women undermined rival claims to honor, and the public distribution of captives demonstrated the Khan's capacity to reward supporters. Soldiers told tales about their leaders' virility and appetite. Those tales reinforced the idea that sexual access was a sovereign right tied to conquest. The spectacle of selection became part of the propaganda of domination. Finally, the human consequences were devastating. Women stripped from their homes lost kinship networks that anchored identity and security. Language, ritual roles, and family ties could be severed overnight. Even when a woman became a favored partner, her autonomy was limited and her status dependent on the ruler's favor. The very things that could grant safety also depended on submission to a system in which she was treated as a possession. Why would rulers seize other rulers' daughters as if they were territory? Stay with us to know. War trophies and the fate of defeated royal women. When a city fell or a kingdom surrendered to Genghis Khan, the taking of land and treasure was only part of the victory. Just as important to the Mongol leader was the capture of the ruling family's women. In the logic of steppe warfare, a royal woman was not simply a person. She was a political asset, a living symbol of sovereignty, and by claiming her, the conqueror claimed a piece of the defeated ruler's identity. This was no accident of conquest. It was deliberate policy. Medieval chronicles repeatedly record this practice. The Secret History of the Mongols and Persian accounts by Rashid al-Din describe how elite women, especially wives and daughters of rulers, were singled out immediately after a conquest. They were often presented to Genghis himself, sometimes in front of their people, as an unmistakable sign that the dynasty had been broken. Taking a royal daughter was like planting a banner over a captured fortress. It announced without words that the former sovereign's bloodline and honor were now under the victor's control. For the Mongols, this tactic served several purposes. First, it humiliated the defeated rulers and made their loss public and personal. Second, it prevented those women from becoming rallying points for resistance by marrying into other powerful houses. Third, it allowed Genghis to either marry them himself or give them to trusted generals, binding those men closer to him through the most intimate kind of reward. In the Mongol political economy, loyalty was not just bought with gold and land, it was sealed through human bonds, often forged in the most coercive ways. History gives striking examples of this pattern. During the defeat of certain Central Asian Khanates, Genghis is recorded as taking the principal wives of slain rulers into his household. In other cases, he handed them to his highest-ranking commanders as part of the spoils. This was not unique to the Mongols. Many medieval and ancient armies saw elite women as prizes of war. But the Mongols elevated it into a calculated, repeatable policy. What is particularly revealing is that these women often retained ceremonial titles even in captivity. A captured queen might still be addressed by her royal honorific, not as a sign of respect, but as a way to demonstrate that even someone of such lofty status was now under the Mongol ruler's authority. The image of a once sovereign woman attending a conqueror's court in fine clothes, surrounded by foreign guards, was a potent statement of dominance that traveled in rumor and tale across the empire. For the women themselves, the experience was a violent inversion of their expected roles. Many had been raised to negotiate marriages as political tools for their own families. Now they were the tools of another man's strategy. Some were forced to bear children who would never inherit their former realms, but instead strengthen the bloodlines of the conqueror's dynasty. The choice was rarely theirs to make. Royal women were also used to anchor Mongol authority in newly conquered regions. By installing a Mongol ruler or a loyal general alongside a local princess, Genghis could present a kind of political hybrid, a local face married into the new imperial order. This could ease resistance in some cases, though for the women it meant living as a visible reminder of their people's subjugation. The brutality of this tactic is amplified by how personal it was. Land can be retaken, fortresses rebuilt, armies reassembled. But the loss of a daughter, wife, or sister to the enemy struck deep into the heart of a family's honor. In many societies of the time, this dishonor could not be undone. That was precisely why it was so effective as a weapon. The accounts of these women's fates remind us that conquest is not only measured in battle deaths or territory gained. It is measured in the reshaping of families, the erasure of lines of inheritance, and the forced rewriting of personal lives for political gain. For Genghis Khan, royal women were not incidental victims of war. They were deliberately targeted assets in his campaign to dominate the largest land empire the world had ever known. Could one man's household become a political institution? Let us tell you. A harem that keeps growing every year. For Genghis Khan, the household was far more than a private space. It was an extension of his empire, a living political map, populated not just by family but by symbols of conquest and alliance. His harem was not a static collection of women. It was a constantly expanding institution, replenished year after year with captives from new campaigns and daughters from allied tribes. In this way, his household became a mechanism for governing an empire as sprawling and diverse as the Mongol realm itself. Contemporary Persian chroniclers such as Rashid al-Din record staggering numbers of hundreds of concubines and multiple wives, reflecting the scale of the Mongol elite's marital networks. 6 official wives held the highest status, each granted her own camp, servants, and court. Around them was a far larger circle of women, princesses taken from defeated dynasties, daughters of steppe nobles, and young captives deemed beautiful enough to enter the Khan's personal quarters. The turnover was relentless. Campaign after campaign brought new additions, and once in the harem, a woman's life became shaped by imperial schedules and political demands. Each wife or consort came with political implications. A Tartar bride might be a token of reconciliation after the slaughter of her people's warriors. A Central Asian princess might serve as a living hostage to ensure her relatives stayed loyal. An exceptionally beautiful woman from a distant tribe could enhance the Khan's prestige, her exotic origins becoming part of his legend. The harem's diversity was both a testament to the empire's reach and a constant reminder of Genghis's domination over many peoples. The structure of the harem reflected the broader organization of the Mongol court. Each principal wife controlled her own tent and territory within the nomadic encampment, complete with retainers and guards. This arrangement gave the wives administrative power, allowing them to manage supplies, resolve disputes, and influence decisions when the Khan was away on campaign. Though some of this authority was genuine, it existed within a system where the ultimate control always rested with Genghis. It is tempting to imagine the harem purely as a luxurious space, but its existence was also a constant strain on resources and a source of political tension. Competition between wives for the Khan's attention could affect the fortunes of their sons. Alliances formed within the harem could sway imperial policies. A single quarrel between senior wives might spill over into disputes among the factions of generals and governors who supported them. In this way, the harem was as politically charged as any council tent. The constant addition of new women also meant that the harem's makeup was never fixed. According to several accounts, Genghis added dozens of women annually, particularly after major campaigns. Some were integrated into the households of his sons or most trusted commanders, but many remained under his direct authority. These women were expected to adapt quickly to Mongol customs, regardless of their backgrounds, and to live under the strict discipline of the imperial household. One remarkable aspect of this system was how it physically mirrored the Mongol Empire's reach. The women came from every corner of Genghis's conquests: the grasslands of Mongolia, the oases of Central Asia, the cities of northern China, and the far western regions near Persia. Their presence in the harem turned the imperial camp into a microcosm of the empire itself. Each woman carried her language, culture, and memories into the household, but over time, these identities were often reshaped to fit the Mongol order. This constant expansion of the harem had another effect on children. The sheer number of offspring from multiple mothers created a complex web of inheritance claims and rivalries. While only the sons of the principal wife, Berta, were considered legitimate heirs to the throne, other children received land, titles, and influence that tied them into the broader ruling structure of the empire. The harem's productivity was therefore not just personal but strategic, feeding new branches into the vast Mongol aristocracy. From the outside, the size of Genghis Khan's household was a source of awe and intimidation. It symbolized the scope of his victories, the depth of his resources, and the unchallenged nature of his authority. To foreign envoys, seeing such a vast array of women from different nations living under one ruler's control was as potent a statement of power as any military parade. Yet behind the spectacle lay the lives of hundreds of women whose presence in the harem was rarely voluntary. For them, the constant influx of new captives was a reminder that the system was built on endless conquest, and that no one's place within it was entirely secure. How did sexual violence become part of a leader's reputation and propaganda? Stay with us to know. Nights of endless conquest beyond the battlefield. Victories on the battlefield brought Genghis Khan fame as a military genius. But there was another, more sinister dimension to his legend, one that had nothing to do with strategy or cavalry charges. Accounts from both Mongol and foreign chroniclers claim that his nights were as relentless as his days, filled with a constant stream of sexual encounters. Whether exaggerated or entirely factual, these stories became part of his myth, shaping how both followers and enemies perceived him. In an age when virility was often equated with power, the idea that Genghis took multiple women every night was not merely gossip, it was a deliberate piece of propaganda. Among his troops, such tales were told with admiration, presenting the Khan's sexual appetite as proof of his unstoppable energy and vitality. In hostile accounts, the same behavior was painted as grotesque excess, a mark of barbarism and cruelty. Both versions served to magnify his image, one as an idealized warrior king, the other as a terrifying, insatiable conqueror. The origins of these claims are tangled in cultural values of the time. Steppe societies, like many medieval cultures, linked a leader's sexual prowess to his fitness to rule. To have many wives and concubines was not merely a personal indulgence, but a public demonstration of dominance over both people and territory. The number of women a ruler could command was often cited alongside the number of warriors in his army or the size of his herds. Foreign chroniclers who encountered these stories often recorded them with a mix of fascination and revulsion. Persian historians noted that after major victories, women of the defeated city, especially those of high birth or great beauty, would be brought to the Khan's quarters. While some were absorbed into his household long-term, others were reportedly there for a single night, their fate decided the next day. These accounts suggest that sexual access was not simply a private act, but a public ritual of conquest. The impact of such behavior was twofold. For his followers, it reinforced the belief that their leader was a man of boundless strength, capable of sustaining the immense demands of both war and personal indulgence. For his enemies, it was a warning. Defeat meant not only the loss of land and life, but also the intimate violation of their families. This made the fear of Mongol attack deeply personal, adding a psychological dimension to the threat of invasion. One particularly revealing aspect is how these stories were passed down. Soldiers and camp followers, who witnessed the distribution of captives after a battle, would embellish tales of the Khan's nightly conquests. By the time such accounts reached distant lands, they had grown into epic feats of endurance, with some claiming that no other ruler in history could match his appetite. Whether or not such exaggerations were encouraged by Genghis himself, they served his interests by cementing an image of unmatched virility and absolute control. It is also worth noting that this reputation could be weaponized diplomatically. Envoys visiting the Mongol court, aware of these stories, often came with lavish gifts of women from their own realms, hoping to gain favor. This reinforced the idea that female beauty was a form of tribute, just as valuable as gold or horses. However, behind the legend was a brutal reality for the women involved. For them, these nights of endless conquest were not trophies or symbols, they were assaults. The psychological trauma of such encounters, compounded by the loss of home, culture, and autonomy, is rarely recorded in historical texts, but it is an inescapable part of the truth. The very acts that made Genghis a figure of awe for some made him a figure of terror for others. This intertwining of sexual violence with political image is one of the most disturbing aspects of his legacy. It demonstrates how acts of personal domination could be scaled into instruments of empire, turning private violations into public theater. The fact that such stories persisted for centuries is proof of their power, regardless of how much was truth and how much was myth-making. What happens when a captive refuses to be a trophy and instead strikes back with deadly defiance? Let us tell you, the Tangut princess's deadly defiance. In the long shadow of Genghis Khan's campaigns, one story stands apart, a tale of defiance so personal and so audacious that it has echoed through centuries of folklore. It takes place during his final campaign against the Tangut kingdom, also known as Western Shia, in the early months of 1227. The Mongols had returned to crush a rebellion, and victory seemed inevitable. Yet the legend tells us that inside the tent of the conqueror, the balance of power shifted in an instant. The Tangut princess in this account was no passive captive. According to later versions of the story, she was the daughter of the Tangut ruler, taken as a prize of war after the Mongols slaughtered her father and destroyed his armies. Brought before Genghis himself, she was expected to submit to the conqueror's will, but instead of surrendering, she carried a hidden dagger concealed in her hair, a weapon of both last resort and symbolic defiance. The legend claims that as Genghis approached her, the princess struck without hesitation, severing his testicles. Some accounts say she immediately turned the blade on herself, leaping into a nearby river to avoid capture and punishment. Others claim she died at the hands of Mongol guards. The river, in some tellings, was renamed Khatun Gol Princess River in her memory. Whether this account is literal history or carefully constructed legend, it has captivated generations for a reason. To the Tangut people, it became a story of ultimate resistance, a single woman daring to wound the most feared man in the world at the height of his power. For the Mongols, it may have been a cautionary tale told in hushed tones, a reminder that even the most tightly controlled spoils of war could harbor danger. Modern historians approach the tale with skepticism. Contemporary sources from the time of Genghis's death are inconsistent about its cause. Some attribute it to illness, possibly malaria or typhus contracted during the campaign. Others mention a fall from a horse. Still others speak vaguely of a wound that became infected. The dramatic story of castration does not appear in the earliest chronicles, leading scholars to suspect it may have been a later embellishment by enemies of the Mongols, designed to tarnish the Khan's invincible image. Yet, the persistence of the story is telling. Folklore has a way of carrying emotional truths even when the facts are unclear. Whether or not the Tangut princess actually struck the fatal blow, her story gave voice to the rage and resistance of countless women taken in war, whose suffering is often absent from the official histories. The tale survives not because it can be proven, but because it satisfies a deep human desire to believe that even the mightiest tyrant can be brought low by an act of courage. The symbolic power of the legend is immense. In a world where women were often reduced to prizes and bargaining chips, the image of one turning the tables, if only for a moment, carries an enduring appeal. It inverts the narrative of the conqueror claiming the conquered, reminding us that even in the darkest circumstances, agency and defiance were not entirely extinguished. It is also notable that the method of resistance targeting Genghis's reproductive ability has a metaphorical weight. His sexual dominance was central to his political persona and legacy, and striking at that core was a symbolic assault on his entire system of conquest. Whether by fact or fiction, the act attacks the very image he cultivated. Even in its uncertainty, the story has left a mark on cultural memory. Local traditions in some regions still point to rivers or sites linked to the princess's last stand. In modern retellings, she becomes an emblem of unyielding defiance, her name rarely recorded, her act unforgettable. When marriage becomes a calculated tool of war, who gains power and who becomes the prize? Stay with us to know. Marriage as a weapon of war. In the Mongol world of the 12th and 13th centuries, marriage was rarely about romance. It was strategy in its most intimate form. For Genghis Khan, the union of two people could be as decisive as the union of two armies. A marriage could seal an alliance, pacify a rebellious tribe, or bind a conquered family to the new imperial order. And while such arrangements often appeared ceremonial, beneath the layers of tradition and festivity lay the unspoken reality. They were frequently forged in the fires of coercion. From his youth, Genghis had understood the political value of marriage. His own union with Berta, arranged when they were children, was a strategic alliance between clans. But once he rose to power, the scale of his marriage diplomacy expanded dramatically. Defeated rulers' daughters were often compelled to wed either the Khan himself or one of his trusted generals. This was no simple act of possession. It was a deliberate way to erase the old political order and replace it with one loyal to the Mongols. On the steppes, such marriages carried immense symbolic weight. When a ruler's daughter married into the Mongol elite, it sent a clear signal that her family's power had been absorbed by the conquerors. The bride became a living treatise, her presence in the Mongol court a constant reminder that her people's fate was now bound to their new masters. For the Mongols, this was more than diplomacy. It was domination dressed in the language of alliance. Some of these unions were steeped in irony. Genghis sometimes married the daughters of men he had personally killed in battle. This practice was not unique to the Mongols. Many warrior cultures saw value in claiming the most prized relatives of their defeated enemies. But in the Mongol context, it was both a political statement and a personal victory, one that fused the spoils of war with the fabric of governance. The power dynamics of these marriages were complex. Official wives, especially those from influential clans, could wield genuine influence. Some advised the Khan on political matters or mediated disputes between factions. Their voices could sway decisions in the council tent, and their favor could elevate the fortunes of their sons. Yet their position was never fully secure, dependent as it was on the Khan's will and the shifting tides of imperial politics. The cultural norms of the steppes also shaped these unions. Polygyny was common among the wealthy and powerful, and each wife typically maintained her own household. This gave prominent wives a degree of autonomy, but it also meant constant competition for influence. Behind the facade of harmony, rivalries brewed, especially when multiple wives came from different tribes with competing interests. Marriage as a weapon was not always used against enemies. It could also be deployed to secure loyalty from allies. Genghis might marry his daughters to leaders of trusted tribes, ensuring that their fortunes were tied to the Mongol court. These men became in effect family-making betrayal, both politically costly and personally shameful. This strategy mirrored older steppe traditions, in which marriage was one of the strongest forms of alliance-making, but under Genghis it became an imperial instrument. The personal cost to the women involved was enormous. Even when treated with respect, they were often far from home, surrounded by strangers, and expected to embrace foreign customs. Many left behind families who had been defeated or killed by the very man they were now bound to. For them, the wedding tent was as much a cage as it was a stage. This policy extended beyond Genghis's own lifetime. His descendants continued to use marriage as a tool for controlling the vast Mongol realm. The pattern he established of binding rival clans through unions that masked subjugation remained a key part of imperial politics well into the era of Kublai Khan and beyond. In the end, marriage under Genghis Khan's rule was less about two lives joining together and more about two powers merging unequally. It was a political transaction where the dowry was influenced, the vows were submitted, and the wedding feast was often a silent mourning for the bride's lost freedom. What can one rescue reveal about the brutal normality of a world built on abduction? Let us tell you. The abduction and violation of Borta. Long before Genghis Khan became the ruler of the largest land empire in history, he was Temujin, a young man struggling to survive the constant feuds and shifting alliances of the Mongol steppe. One event from his youth shaped him profoundly, both as a man and as a leader: the abduction of his first wife, Berta. What makes this story striking is not only the personal stakes involved, but the way it reflects a widespread, brutal practice that was considered normal in his world. Berta and Temujin's marriage had been arranged when they were children. Their union was intended to strengthen ties between their families, as marriages often did in steppe society. When Temujin was around 16, He formally married her, and she moved into his camp. But the peace between their clans was fragile. Old rivalries simmered just beneath the surface. The Merkit tribe, long-standing enemies of Temujin's family, saw an opportunity for revenge. Years earlier, Temujin's father had stolen his mother from the Merkits, an act remembered bitterly across generations. Now, with Temujin newly married, the Merkits strike back. They raided his camp, seized Berta, and carried her away to become the wife of a Merkit warrior. For 8 months, Berta lived in captivity. Contemporary accounts, including the secret history of the Mongols, make clear that during this time she was repeatedly raped. In steppe warfare, this was not considered an extraordinary cruelty. It was a grimly accepted tactic. Women were taken as spoils, both to humiliate the enemy and to integrate them into the victor's household. In Berta's case, her abduction was both a personal vendetta and a public statement. The Merkits were avenging the insult inflicted by Temujin's father decades before. Temujin's response to Berta's abduction was swift and determined. He sought help from allies, notably his blood brother Jamuka and the powerful ruler Togrul of the Karaites. With their support, he mounted a campaign against the Merkits. This alliance was not just about rescuing his wife, it was a test of his emerging leadership, showing that he could unite different groups under a single cause. When Berta was finally recovered, she was already pregnant. Shortly after her return, she gave birth to her first son, Yoki. Although Temujin publicly accepted Jochi as his own, doubts lingered among other Mongol leaders about the boy's paternity. This shadow would follow Jochi throughout his life, sometimes influencing the political dynamics among Genghis's heirs. Yet in private and public life, Berta retained her position as Temujin's primary wife and closest advisor. Berta's return to the Mongol camp was not the end of her suffering, but it did mark the beginning of her rise to influence. She would go on to become the Grand Empress of the Mongol Empire, her sons holding the legitimate claim to succession. Still, the circumstances of her abduction highlight how deeply woven sexual violence was into the fabric of warfare on the steppe. Abductions like Berta's were not isolated crimes, they were part of a system. Raiding enemy camps to take women served multiple functions. It punished rivals, enriched the victors' households, and created new political bonds. These practices were so embedded in the culture that even leaders who had personally suffered from them often used them in turn when they became powerful. For Temujin, the episode had lasting consequences beyond the personal. It hardened his resolve to be the one doing the taking rather than the one suffering loss. In later years, his armies would carry out the same acts against enemies, seizing wives and daughters to consolidate his rule. In this sense, Berta's abduction is both a personal story of resilience and a grim foreshadowing of the policies that would define his empire. The rescue of Berta is often told as a tale of loyalty and determination, but it also forces us to confront the normalization of violence against women in this era. Berta's position as the Khan's chief wife shielded her from many dangers later in life, yet her early ordeal shows how precarious any woman's safety was in a world where marriage and abduction could be two sides of the same coin. Did ancient steppe customs make cruelty inevitable? Or did the Mongol Empire magnify it into something far more devastating? Stay with us to know. Women as spoils in steppe culture. Long before the name Genghis Khan struck fear across continents, the open grasslands of Mongolia and Central Asia had already been a theatre of conflict, revenge, and raiding. For centuries, tribal rivalries had been fought not only with arrows and sabers but through the capture of people. Among the most coveted prizes were women. They were seen as assets able to forge alliances through forced marriage, bolster a household's labor, or serve as living symbols of a tribe's triumph. On the steppe, a man's prestige could be measured not only by the number of horses in his herd or warriors in his camp, but also by the women he could claim. Bride capture was deeply ingrained in this culture. At times it was ceremonial, a staged abduction to formalize an agreed marriage. But when it occurred between rival groups, it was an open act of hostility. Taking a woman from another clan was a direct challenge to her family's honor and an announcement of the captor's strength. These acts rarely ended quietly. They often set off cycles of retaliation, ensuring that violence and displacement remained constant realities of life on the steppe. In such a world, women lived with the knowledge that safety was precarious. The simple act of traveling to a nearby stream or tending livestock could turn perilous if they crossed into disputed land. Even those married into influential clans were not immune. As the ordeal of Berta, Genghis Khan's first wife, shows, protection could vanish in an instant, replaced by vulnerability when old rivalries resurfaced. Genghis Khan did not invent these customs, but he elevated them into an imperial strategy. Where traditional raids might bring in a few captives, his conquests could uproot entire communities. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of women were swept up in a single campaign, scattered across the Mongol realm. This was no longer sporadic tribal raiding. It was the industrial-scale capture and redistribution of women as a tool of governance. The distribution of these captives was anything but random. Noble women might be placed in the households of Genghis's sons or top generals to secure loyalty. Others were given as rewards to soldiers, a gesture that tied their fortunes to their leader. This ensured that sexual violence was not an uncontrolled byproduct of war, but a planned feature of the Mongol system woven into the very structure of imperial expansion. The logic behind this was as pragmatic as it was ruthless. Women brought into the empire expanded its population, strengthened its households, and produced children connected by blood to the Mongol elite. Some of these children became cultural intermediaries, easing the integration of conquered peoples. Others were used as political pawns, married off to cement yet more alliances. For the women themselves, the consequences were profound. A few adapted and found influence in their new positions, but most lived in isolation, cut off from their families, their languages, and the customs they had known. Identities were stripped away, replaced by roles that served the empire's needs rather than their own. Mongol-born women from ruling clans could hold significant sway. They managed camps, made diplomatic decisions, and commanded resources in their husband's absence. Yet this authority rarely extended to the foreign captives in their midst. For those outsiders, the hierarchy was rigid, their status fixed by the whims of the men who controlled them. By codifying and expanding these traditions, Genghis Khan magnified their cruelty. What had once been small-scale tribal practices became empire-wide policies, repeated in region after region. From the towns of northern China to the far edges of Persia, women's stories of capture and forced assimilation became an unspoken but ever-present legacy of Mongol conquest. This reality reminds us that empires are not only built through military victories, they are also constructed through the reshaping and often the breaking of private lives. In Genghis Khan's empire, women's bodies became both the battlegrounds and the building blocks of political power. How could the exploitation of women ripple through the centuries until it left a trace in the DNA of millions alive today? Stay with us to know. A legacy written in bloodlines. In 2003, a team of geneticists uncovered a remarkable pattern in the Y chromosomes of men across Asia. They found a distinct genetic signature that appeared in an estimated 16 million living men, about 0.5% of the male population of the planet at that time. When they traced its origin, the trail led back roughly 1,000 years to the steppes of Mongolia. The likely source? A single, extraordinarily prolific man. The obvious historical candidate was Genghis Khan. His conquests had stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, bringing him into contact directly and indirectly with countless communities. The accounts from his lifetime describe a ruler who not only took many wives but also absorbed hundreds of concubines into his household over the years. This combination of political power, social status, and vast mobility created conditions in which one man's genetic line could spread with unusual speed and reach. In the Mongol world, reproduction was more than a personal matter. It was a political act. Sons were heirs, not only to property, but to power. By fathering children with women from conquered peoples, Genghis and his descendants forged blood ties that could help integrate new territories into the empire. In some cases, these children served as symbolic proof that the defeated community was now part of the Mongol world. The size of Genghis's legitimate family alone is impressive. He had 6 official wives, each with her own household, and numerous concubines. His sons with Berta, his first wife, were considered his true heirs, but the many other children he fathered still held positions of influence. His son Tushi, Jochi, is said to have had 40 sons of his own, and his grandson Kublai Khan fathered 22 children. When such patterns are multiplied across generations, the potential for rapid genetic spread becomes clear. The key to this expansion lay in the privileges of the ruling elite. In most societies, reproductive success was uneven, with powerful men often fathering many more children than the average. In the Mongol Empire, the scale of this imbalance was amplified by conquest. Victories brought new women into the ruling circle, sometimes by the dozens in a single campaign season. In this way, military expansion directly translated into genetic expansion. It is worth remembering that for the women involved, this genetic legacy often came at the cost of freedom, autonomy, and safety. The same patterns that produced millions of descendants were rooted in forced unions and the systemic exploitation of captives. The genetic footprint is a living reminder of the reach of the Mongol conquests, but also of the personal histories erased in the process. Modern science cannot prove with absolute certainty that every man carrying the Genghis Y chromosome is his direct descendant, but the statistical likelihood is strong. The genetic signature is concentrated in regions corresponding closely to the Mongol Empire's core territories and areas where his armies campaigned. Its persistence over centuries shows how political dominance can leave marks not just on maps, but in the very biology of a population. The story of Genghis Khan's genetic legacy is a striking example of how history, power, and human lives intertwine. It shows that the consequences of conquest can last far beyond the fall of empires, lingering in the blood of millions who may never know their connection to a long-dead ruler. And it forces us to consider the human cost behind those statistics, a cost paid largely by women whose names and stories did not survive, even as their genetic contribution endures. What was life really like inside the Khan's glittering yet confining harem for the women who lived there? Stay with us to know. Concubines caught between privilege and imprisonment. From the outside, Genghis Khan's harem might have seemed like a sanctuary of wealth and refinement. To foreign envoys and noble visitors, it was a vision of elegance. Women draped in fine silks embroidered with gold thread, adorned with precious stones, moving gracefully among richly furnished tents. The scent of exotic incense lingered in the air, and the sounds of soft music from stringed instruments floated through the camp. But behind this carefully curated image was a far more complicated reality, one where privilege and captivity lived side by side, and where every smile could conceal the quiet weight of loss. The harem was not a single enclosed palace. Instead, it was spread across multiple sections of the Mongol encampment, with each official wife presiding over her own household. These were like small courts in themselves, complete with personal guards, attendants, and administrative staff. The wives oversaw supplies, coordinated the work of servants, and settled disputes among those under their care. This structure gave them a level of influence in domestic and political affairs, particularly when Genghis was away on campaign. Yet, even at the peak of their authority, their power was conditional, rooted entirely in their connection to the Khan. For concubines, the circumstances were very different. Most were captives from newly conquered territories, chosen for their beauty, their lineage, or simply as tokens of victory. Some were presented as diplomatic gifts by generals eager to win favor. Others were taken directly by the Khan himself during campaigns. Once inside the harem, these women found themselves subject to strict rules. Their movements were limited, conversations with outsiders were rare, and their daily lives revolved around the Khan's timetable and preferences. Although some concubines rose to favored positions, such advancement was precarious. A child, especially a son, could secure better living conditions, more attendance, and greater influence. But this also bred intense competition. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface as women sought to win the Khan's attention, forge alliances with influential wives, or undermine potential threats to their standing. A single change in favor could elevate one woman and diminish another in an instant. Beyond the personal dynamics, the harem served a deeply political function. Each woman was a symbol of Genghis's reach. A Chinese beauty might be a reminder of victories in the east. A Persian noblewoman could signify triumph in the west. Even those of lower rank often came from prominent families in their own communities, their presence serving as a form of living leverage to keep their relatives loyal or at least submissive to the Mongol throne. In this way, the harem was both a private space and a strategic network of influence. Still, beneath the silken ceremony lay the reality of captivity. Many of these women had been taken in moments of chaos, cities in flames, families scattered, homes left in ruins. Even if they adjusted to life in the harem, the knowledge of how they arrived there could never be erased. Marriages and relationships were arranged without consent, and affection, if it ever developed, existed under the shadow of coercion. Their survival often depended on their ability to navigate a delicate balance of compliance and subtle self-assertion. The harem was also a display to outsiders, carefully arranged to impress visiting dignitaries. The diversity of its women was a human map of Genghis's conquests, Mongol-born wives alongside women from the Russian steppes, the cities of Central Asia, and the ports of northern China. This visual reminder of the empire's vastness was as potent as any military parade. For the Khan, it was an unspoken declaration that his authority reached across cultures, languages, and continents. Yet the voices of the women themselves are almost entirely absent from historical records. What we know comes through second-hand accounts of Persian historians, European travelers, or Chinese envoys, each shaped by their own perspectives and political agendas. This silence is not surprising. The women of the harem lived in a controlled environment where speaking openly could be dangerous. Their experiences, while central to the workings of the empire, were often dismissed as irrelevant to the official chronicles of conquest. The contradictions of the harem made it a place of both opportunity and confinement. Some women leveraged their positions to protect their children, influence political decisions, or advocate for their native peoples. Others resigned themselves to survival, accepting the routines imposed upon them. For many, it was a gilded cage, luxurious in appearance, but unyielding in its restrictions. The privileges they enjoyed were inseparable from the circumstances that had taken them from their former lives. In the end, life inside Genghis Khan's harem was a mirror of the empire itself. Dazzling in scale and power, yet built on foundations of violence and control. It offered glimpses of influence for a select few, but for most, it was a reminder of a past they could never return to and a future bound by the will of one man. How could acts of sexual domination be used not only to control individuals but to crush the spirit of entire nations? The psychological warfare of sexual conquest. In the brutal world of medieval conquest, Genghis Khan understood that victory was not only about defeating armies or capturing cities. It was also about breaking the will of a people so completely that resistance became unthinkable. His campaigns demonstrated a chilling awareness of how psychological warfare could be wielded, and one of the most devastating tools in this arsenal was sexual domination. This form of violence was not random, nor was it an unfortunate byproduct of war. It was, in many cases, a deliberate act designed to send a message both to the victims and to the survivors who would tell their stories. The logic was as cold as it was effective. In many of the cultures Genghis conquered, the honor of a family, clan, or kingdom was closely tied to the chastity and dignity of its women. To violate them was to strike at the heart of that society's identity. It was a form of humiliation that could not be undone, and it carried lasting social consequences for the women themselves, their families, and their communities. Genghis used this understanding to turn acts of personal violation into symbols of total domination. The seizure of high-ranking women wives, daughters, and sisters of rulers was especially potent. It removed key figures from the political structure of a defeated state, disrupting alliances and preventing those women from forging new ones that could threaten Mongol authority. But the act went beyond political calculation. Publicly taking or distributing these women sent a clear, unmistakable message. Your leaders cannot protect you, and your most sacred bonds mean nothing under Mongol rule. There are accounts from both Mongol and foreign chroniclers describing how, after a city fell, its most prominent women were separated from the general population. They were presented to Genghis and his senior commanders, sometimes in ceremonies reinforcing the message of conquest. For onlookers, defeated warriors, surviving family members, and the broader community, the humiliation was complete. These acts also undermined morale before the Mongols reached their next target. Word of such treatment spread quickly, and some cities surrendered without a fight. The psychological impact on the women was profound. Many were torn from their homes, forced into unfamiliar cultures, and compelled to serve the men who had destroyed their families. For elite women, the sudden shift from political actor to pawn was devastating. For those of lower rank, it often meant the complete erasure of their previous lives. But the Mongol use of sexual conquest was not solely about punishment. It could also serve to integrate and control new populations. Children born from such unions, especially if their mothers were from influential families, could be used to bind conquered peoples to the empire. These offspring were living symbols of the new order, their mixed heritage representing the fusion, albeit forced, of old dynasties with Mongol power. Yet even this integration was built on the foundations of coercion and subjugation. This strategy also played into the Mongol image of invincibility. By demonstrating that they could take whatever and whoever they wanted, the Khan's forces cultivated an aura of unstoppable dominance. To resist them was to invite not only death, but dishonor on a scale that could outlast generations. In societies where collective honor mattered as much as physical survival, this was a weapon as effective as any sword. It is important to note that the Mongols were not unique in using sexual violence as a tool of war. Throughout history, from ancient empires to modern conflicts, armies have understood its power to terrorize and control. What distinguishes the Mongol approach is the degree to which it appears to have been woven into their broader strategy of conquest. It was not simply tolerated, it was, at times, orchestrated. For Genghis Khan, every act of domination, whether on the battlefield or in the private sphere, was part of a larger design. His genius as a strategist lay not only in his ability to win battles, but in his understanding of how to maintain control over the vast territories he conquered. By striking at the psychological core of his enemies, he made rebellion less likely, submission more certain, and his own authority more absolute. The scars left by this form of warfare were not confined to the generation that experienced it. They were passed down through stories, through altered social structures, and through the unspoken weight of collective trauma. Communities that had been targeted in this way often carried a deep sense of humiliation that could linger for centuries, shaping their relationships with power and authority long after the Mongols were gone. Even today, the historical memory of Genghis Khan is split. In Mongolia, he is revered as a nation-builder and cultural hero. In many of the regions he conquered, however, his name remains synonymous with destruction, cruelty, and dishonor. This dual legacy is a reminder that the same acts that secured his empire also inflicted wounds that never fully healed. By understanding the role of sexual conquest in Genghis Khan's campaigns, we see more clearly the true nature of his power. It was not built solely on military brilliance or political skill. It was also built on a calculated willingness to use the most intimate forms of violence to achieve his goals, violence that shattered lives, redefined identities, and reshaped entire societies. How did later generations and historians manage to transform such atrocities into stories that glorified the conqueror? Stay here to know. How history sanitized his crimes against women. The Genghis Khan remembered in Mongolian folklore, national monuments, and school textbooks is often a very different figure from the one described by his victims. Over time, the narrative of his life has been polished, reshaped, and even romanticized, so much so that the systematic sexual violence he orchestrated is either glossed over or omitted entirely. This process of historical sanitization has allowed his image to shift from that of a ruthless conqueror to a celebrated unifier and lawgiver, obscuring the suffering endured by thousands of women during his reign. Part of this transformation stems from the nature of historical record-keeping in the 13th century. The most detailed Mongol-era account, The Secret History of the Mongols, was written for an audience within the ruling elite. It aimed to celebrate Genghis's achievements, justify his rise to power, and instruct his descendants. While it mentions episodes like the abduction of Berta, it frames them in ways that highlight Genghis's loyalty and courage rather than addressing the larger pattern of abductions and sexual coercion that marked his conquests. Foreign chroniclers, especially Persian and Chinese historians writing under Mongol rule, also shaped his image carefully. Some emphasized his tolerance for different religions, his skill in administration, and his military genius. They understood that to serve in a court dependent on Mongol patronage required avoiding certain truths, or presenting them in a way that reflected well on the ruler. As a result, the suffering of captured women was often reduced to a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. In regions where his armies had inflicted the greatest devastation, a different kind of selective memory took shape. Here, the atrocities were remembered vividly, but they were often transformed into cautionary tales or folklore. The story of the Tangut princess who allegedly killed Genghis before taking her own life is one example. Whether historically accurate or not, such stories allowed communities to reframe victimhood into resistance. Yet even these narratives tended to focus on moments of defiance, leaving the broader, more widespread realities of sexual violence unaddressed. As centuries passed, the image of Genghis Khan evolved to serve new purposes. In the 20th century, Mongolian nationalism reclaimed him as a symbol of unity, independence, and cultural pride. School children learned about his military campaigns, his legal code, the Yasa, and his ability to weld warring tribes into a single disciplined force. His role in fostering trade along the Silk Road and promoting cultural exchange was celebrated. In this retelling, the atrocities committed against women were quietly excluded, as they clashed with the vision of Genghis as a heroic founder of the nation. Outside Mongolia, his legacy has also been reshaped by popular history and entertainment. Modern documentaries and historical novels often frame him as a brilliant but misunderstood leader, emphasizing his strategic genius while sidestepping the darker aspects of his rule. This selective storytelling not only downplays the violence but risks normalizing it, treating it as an unfortunate but inevitable part of medieval warfare. The reasons for this sanitization are complex. Heroic national narratives require clean figures, not deeply flawed ones. Political agendas often prioritize unity over truth. And in global popular culture, tales of conquest, adventure, and empire still attract more fascination than sober accounts of their human cost. When women's experiences are left out of these narratives, the result is a history that is incomplete at best and complicit at worst. It is only in recent decades that historians, anthropologists, and gender studies scholars have begun to recenter the experiences of women in the story of the Mongol Empire. Their work has shown that the violence committed against women was not incidental. It was a core part of how the empire was built and maintained. Recognizing this fact challenges the sanitized versions of Genghis's life and forces a more honest reckoning with his legacy. Reintroducing these truths into the historical record is not about erasing Genghis Khan's achievements as a military strategist or empire builder. It is about acknowledging that those achievements came at a staggering human cost. To understand the full scope of his impact, we must hold both sides of the story, the unity he created and the destruction he unleashed, without letting one erase the other. The process of rewriting history in this way is ongoing. In Mongolia, discussions about how to teach Genghis's legacy are still sensitive. In global scholarship, The balance between recognizing his accomplishments and confronting his crimes continues to be debated. What is certain is that as long as the voices of the women who lived and suffered under his rule remain silent in mainstream narratives, the story of Genghis Khan will remain only half told. Were you shocked by the horrific truths about what Genghis Khan did to the women he captured? Which part of his story disturbed you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below.